Hey everyone, how's it going? It's the holiday season, and I thought it would be nice to have a little Christmas themed video in celebration. In keeping with the general motif of the channel being about history, I decided that the best course of action was to tell some war stories. Stories of soldiers celebrating their Christmases while at war, and some celebrating their Christmases in the middle of direct conflict. We'll be reading three different stories, all from the Battle of the Bulge, and if you want to read these stories for yourself and others, I'll link to the newsletter that I found them from. I'll also link to the newsletter's archives, as it has tons of stories from the Battle of the Bulge if you would be interested in reading them. And so, without any further delay, let's get right into it with our first story. Our first story is titled Grateful for the Small Things by Lionel P. Atta. Although my Christmas Day 1944 was not unusual in either a good or bad sense, I still remember most of it vividly. Our unit was moved a day or two earlier from one position on Ellsbourne Ridge to another. I had started to dig a new fighting and sleeping hole, and as I awoke, I knew I would have a day of work ahead. I remember watching, from the heights of the ridge, a pale sun rising over the battered steeple of the church in Cringkelt. In spite of the circumstances, that sight gave me a feeling of comfort and peace. I was grateful also that this morning the German artillery was silent and that I had survived the fighting of the past week. It was not very cold, the dark brown earth fairly soft, and my digging was progressing well. Suddenly, as I looked up, I saw two GIs, tense and with bloodshot eyes, carrying two cans. One of them thrust a small, almost cold turkey leg into my hand, the other handed me two slices of white bread and a couple pieces of hard candy. This was my Christmas dinner. As I crouched in my still fairly shallow hole and started to eat the turkey before it turned stone cold, 88mm shells began falling around us. Almost choking on that first bite, I realized that the Germans were watching those two poor soldiers and harassing them with artillery fire as they delivered our meals. The barrage was short. When the shelling stopped, I looked up and the men were gone. A few minutes later, I heard shells exploding perhaps 50 yards away. Undoubtedly, the German gunners were zeroing in on the two men as they moved from position to position. It seemed almost criminal to me that the lives of soldiers could be jeopardized for such an almost meaningless gesture, perhaps so that some quartermaster officer could report to his superior that every man in his sector had turkey on Christmas Day. I would have preferred one of my K rations anyway. I remained concerned about protecting myself from artillery, so I worked on my position all day. A few days later, with the help of a sergeant, I was able to salvage a door from the only nearby building. I covered the sleeping portion of my hole with it and then piled dirt on top of it. Shortly thereafter, as I was asleep, a shell struck a corner of the hole, the explosion splitting the door and partially collapsing the cover. My ears rang for a week, but the cover probably saved me from serious injury or worse. That night, as I saw and heard the signs of battle raging miles to our rear, I again felt a sense of gratitude. At least on this day, Christmas Day, the war had passed us by. Our second story is titled There Was Food in the Inn, as written by Raymond W. Locke. We stayed in the house with the infantry and lived in the cellar overlooking the valley below, which was still occupied by the Germans. We noticed that the Germans kept entering and leaving a big Bavarian inn, taking out food and wine. On Christmas Eve, some of the 30th Infantry Does said they were going to send a patrol down to the inn and drive the Germans out and bring back some cheese, bread, wine, etc. to our position so we could celebrate Christmas. My Sherman 75mm and my 30 caliber machine gun was set up to control the narrow pathway into the valley below. The Does and I made sure we were aware of the correct password for the night so that they could come back safely through our checkpoint. As I remember, it was about 2 hours before the Does came back from the valley. They not only came back with all kinds of food and drinks, but also brought up the innkeeper and his small daughter. The innkeeper had been shot in both feet to prevent his escape, and his daughter had been shot in the hip. The does took him to our medics for treatment and transport to a hospital in Malmedy. That is how I spent the cold but beautiful Christmas in Stavelot, December 25th, 1944. I looked up into the clear, cold sky and thought that my wife and 7-year-old daughter were able to see the same sky in Virginia. I said a Christmas prayer that I too would be allowed to live through all of this and be able to return soon to Virginia with them once more. And our final story is titled A Truce of Sorts by Ralph G. Hill, Jr. 4 Americans lost and separated from their units on December 16th, 1944. In the bitter cold, on Christmas Eve, saw a Belgian farmhouse with a smoking chimney in the distance. Full of terror that it was German occupied, they approached hoping to obtain shelter for their frozen limbs. A Belgian woman with broken English answered the door and welcomed them to the comfort of the home with a blazing fireplace and invited them to share the meager food available. Within an hour, a knock came to her door, and this time the Belgian woman welcomed to her home 5 German soldiers. Sternly, first in German, then in English, she proclaimed, "Tonight there will be only peace in this home." Under her guidance, complete confidence, calm, and comradeship took over to replace the initial terror. She created this by leading in Christmas carols, first in English, then in German. Finally, a blending of voices occurred as the same carol was sung in English and German. After a night of warm sleep, the Germans stated they were going to move south, and the Americans agreed that they would move north. After the Germans left, the Americans left and, in time, found their unit. One wrote to tell me of the most treasured memory of his life, and how, after the war, he returned with his family to find the Belgian family, who proclaimed it was their most treasured memory. Alrighty, and that's going to be it for this week's video. Bit of a shorter video this week, as well, it is Christmas, and, I'm doing other stuff. So, of course, thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the bell. Make sure you have a nice Christmas or just holiday weekend in general. Of course, I'll be back here next week with a new video. I hope you enjoyed this video, and at the very least, I hope you learned something. So have a happy holiday, a Merry Christmas, or whatever you celebrate. So, see ya.